Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. Today I want to discuss Incus clusters. And so this is going to be just a very simple overview of Incus clusters, and that's why I'm calling it Incus Clusters 101. So clustering provides higher availability than just a single standalone Incus server. And also, when people think about clusters, pretty frequently they also think about load balancing. And so load balancing is not really an inherent part of Incus clusters, although it can be achieved by using OVN, Open Virtual Networks. But that's a discussion for another day. So an Incus cluster consists of one bootstrap server and at least two other cluster members. You can create a cluster with only two members, but the loss of one of those members results in a lack of quorum for the distributed database. And the whole point of a cluster is to have higher availability and higher reliability. So in a cluster with three members, all members replicate the database that stores the state of the cluster. So I'm going to set up a test cluster. And the initial cluster member that forms a cluster is referred to as the bootstrap server, and the others are indicated as member servers. So our servers are going to be, first of all, VMS Cloud-Incus, and there's its IP address. And it might be noteworthy to point out that all of your Incus servers must be on a network where they could communicate with each other. So my bootstrap server is actually an existing server, and it has some containers on it currently. So as right now, that bootstrap server is a standalone Incus server, and we're going to convert it from a standalone server to the first member of a cluster. Our second server, VMS Fog-Incus, is going to be our first cluster member after the boot server, and that machine also has containers on it. However, when we join it to the existing cluster that has VMS Cloud-Incus on it, the containers on VMS Fog-Incus cannot be included. In fact, they need to be lost. So in the third system we have here is, I'm just calling Incus-member, and I have Incus installed on it, but I've never done an Incus admin init, so it is an unconfigured Incus server. So really, I have all three types. An Incus server that has been configured and has containers on it, but those containers will be the foundation of the beginning of the cluster. An Incus container server that has containers on it, but cannot be migrated because it's going to be the member of a cluster, and an Incus server which has never been configured. So let's go form our simple cluster. Just as a review, VMS Mist, VMS Rain, and Mondo are all Incus servers that I converted from LXD servers. And VMS Fog and VMS Cloud are both LXD servers, and VMS Cloud-Incus is going to be our bootstrap server for our new cluster, and I've featured that one on the channel before for some of my other demonstrations. And we now have VMS Fog-Incus. If we quickly take a look at VMS Cloud-Incus, you'll see that it has one container here called test, and it has two virtual machines, which are simply desktop virtual machines. And now, if we go back to servers and we look at VMS Fog-Incus, which will be our first member server, it currently has one container and one virtual machine. The one container is called test-2404, and the one virtual machine is called desktop-fog. So when we join VMS Fog-Incus to our cluster as our first member server, we're going to lose the two containers that are hosted on it, because when it joins the cluster, it will only respect and record the containers that are on the original server that form the cluster. And you might notice that Incus-member is absent from this list, and the reason for that is because although I installed Incus on that server, I did not do an Incus admin init on it, so I don't have any way to connect to that server from Lex console. And so now I've moved down to a terminal on my desktop machine Mondo, and I can do an Incus list on VMS Cloud-Incus : and since I have remote management set up, I can do a listing of the containers on that particular system. And likewise, I can also do the same thing for VMS Fog, because I have remote management set up for it as well. And to see which nodes that I can remotely manage, I can do an Incus remote list. And here you see that VMS Cloud and VMS Fog-Incus, both of these are listed in this list. So let's go SSH over to VMS Cloud-Incus. And now that we're logged into VMS Cloud-Incus, I will be able to enable the cluster by creating the bootstrap node. To convert my standalone Incus server to the first node or the bootstrap node of my cluster, and in fact to create a cluster, I'm going to do an Incus cluster enable VMS Cloud-Incus. And of course I get failed to configure cluster, cannot use wildcard core.https _address. In order to fix that, we're going to issue the command incus config set cluster.https _address to be the address of my cluster, or the address of this particular machine, which is VMS Cloud-Incus : port 44 or port 8443. And once we do that, then we should be able to do the Incus cluster enable VMS Cloud-Incus. And now it says that clustering is enabled on this machine, and we now have a cluster. I've gone ahead and split screened between two terminals here. The top is VMS Cloud-Incus, and that is our bootstrap node for our cluster. So if I do an Incus cluster list here, it's listed as the database leader and also the system that has the database. The bottom window has VMS Fog-Incus, which is still a standalone Incus machine. And if we do an Incus cluster list here, it says that this server is not part of a cluster. And also, if we do an Incus list, we can list out containers on this particular server. Although VMS Fog-Incus has two container instances, one being a virtual machine and the other being an Incus container, we're not able to carry those through when we change this to a member node of a cluster, meaning that these containers will be lost unless I back them up with an export command and re-import them later. Let's assume that I backed all these containers up, or I just didn't want them anymore. So the next step would be to do an incus stop space dash dash all. And as close as I can determine, there's no command that allows you to wildcard delete all of your containers. So we're just going to have to do an incus delete on desktop dash fog, which is one of the containers you see there. And then we're going to do an incus delete on test dash 2404. And now both containers running should be stopped and deleted. And so if we do an incus list, there are no containers listed. The next step that we want to do is an incus profile device remove default root. And that says that the device root has been removed from default. And then we want to remove the Ethernet device by doing a incus profile device remove default ETH0. And then finally, if you follow my incus containers step by step, we also want to remove the bridge profile from the default. So we say incus profile device remove default bridge profile, and it says that device doesn't exist. And so I'm just going to go ahead and say incus profile delete bridge profile, and I think that will take care of it, and sure enough it did. And then the next command that we should be doing is a command to remove the bridge device that Incus creates during an Incus admin init, and that's Incus network remove Incus BR0. And so it says that that is an unknown command, and so that may not be needed after all. I just figured it might be something we need. And then we do an Incus storage remove default, and that is also not known. So I'm just going to go ahead and say Incus RM, or Incus network RM Incus BR0, and that went ahead and worked. And then I'm going to go ahead and say Incus RM, or Incus storage RM default, and that should delete that as well. And sure enough, that worked. So now we want to go back up to our VMS Cloud-Incus, which is our bootstrap node, and we're going to do an Incus cluster add VMS Fog-Incus. And that's going to go ahead and give us a join token. And down here in VMS Fog-Incus, we should be able to do a sudo incus admin init. So cluster operations require the sudo command despite being a member of incus-admins group. And so I'm going to provide my sudo password. And would I like to use clustering? Yes, I do. And what IP address or DNS name should be used to reach this server? Well, it's really going to be VMS Fog-Incus, since I have that in my local host table. Are you joining an existing cluster? Yes, we are. Please provide the join token. So this is where we want to go up here and copy this token. I'm going to do a right click and a copy, and come down here and do a Shift Control V to paste it in and hit enter. It says all existing data is lost when joining a cluster. Do you want to continue? Of course, we've already gone and deleted that data, because if I didn't, I found out through my testing that we got an error here. And so it asks for us to choose a size property. You can default that. Choose a source property. We can default that. And choose a pool name, and we can default that. And would you like the YAML to be printed? No, we don't. And we hit enter, and at this point in time, it joins the cluster. Now that the join cluster operation is complete, I can do an Incus cluster list on VMS Fog-Incus, and it will say that VMS Cloud-Incus and VMS Fog-Incus are currently part of this cluster. It says the database leader is VMS Cloud-Incus, and it's also the current database location. And VMS Fog-Incus is the database standby. So keeping that in mind, I can also come up here to VMS Cloud-Incus, and I can do an Incus cluster list here as well. And it lists the same thing. Let's go ahead and join Incus member. An Incus member has never gone through an Incus admin init, so we shouldn't have to delete all of those things. That being said, sometimes when you install an Incus server, it may actually create a default storage pool, or at least the pointers to it. So it's possible you might have to do an Incus storage RM default. So now to tell it how to communicate back to the cluster, we're going to go ahead and have to give it the Incus config set cluster HTTPS address. And in this case, we had address 65, which was for Fog, and this is address 74, which is for Incus-member. Now we want to do a sudo incus admin init. Again, we do the sudo command because we are doing a cluster operation. Yes, we want to use clustering. What IP address would you like to use? I'm going to use incus-member because that's in the host file of all the cluster members. Are you joining an existing cluster? Yes, I am. And now it wants us to provide the join token. So now if I come back over here and I simply do a Incus cluster add incus-member, I will get a join token. I'm going to copy that join token here, do a right click and copy, and then I'm going to go ahead and bring back the terminal for Incus member, and I'll do a shift control V to add that join token. It says all existing data is lost when joining a cluster. I'll say yes, go ahead and continue, keeping in mind that I never did an Incus admin init over here to begin with, so there never was any existing data. And then I default the size property, default the source property, and default the zfs.pool_name property. And no, I don't want to print out a YAML file. I hit enter and it says failed to join cluster, request to add new member. The joining server version doesn't match the expected version. The previous errors were due to the fact that we had not updated the Incus server to exactly the same versions. And as you're probably aware, as of this video, Incus version 6.0 is the latest release, but there have been several minor revisions to it since. So you're probably going to want to do a sudo apt update and a sudo apt upgrade and take any recent version releases of Incus to make sure that all your cluster members are running exactly the same version of Incus. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and do an Incus cluster add Incus-member, and I now have a copy of that token to add this server again. And now I'm going back over here to Incus-member, and I'm going to do a sudo incus admin init once again, and it's going to ask me if I want to use clustering. The answer is yes. But wait a minute, I'm really wary at this point in time, so I'm going to do a Control C out of this routine. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I think that there's a few other steps I'm going to need to do. I think as soon as she runs sudo incus admin init, I think that it creates the storage pool. So I'm going to do an incus storage rm default, and if this comes back and says it deleted the storage pool, well, it didn't, so I'm still okay. All right, so now we'll do a sudo incus admin init, and I'll say, yes, I would like to use clustering. What IP address would you like to use? Well, I want to use incus-member. And then, are you joining an existing cluster? Yes, I am. Provide the join token. There's the token. All existing data is lost when joining the cluster. Continue. Yes. Choose the size property. We want that to be a default. The source property, we want that to be a default. And zfs.pool underbar name will also be a default. And would you like a YAML precede to be printed? No, we don't. And it goes out and successfully joins the cluster. Now that the cluster join has been completed, I should be able to, from this member node, incus-member, I should be able to do an incus cluster list, and I should see all three nodes. And sure enough, I do. So what you're really looking for is the fact that it says that they're online and that they're fully operational. And you can see that all three of them have copies of the database, and currently the database master or database leader is VMS Cloud-Incus. So here we are back at my Lex console interface, and you can see that I have an entry for both VMS Fog-Incus and VMS Cloud-Incus, which used to be standalone nodes, but now they're members of a cluster. If I click on VMS Fog-Incus, the first one listed here, it says I have one container named test, and I have two virtual machines, desktop and desktop 2404. If I go down to cluster members on the left-hand margin, it will list VMS Cloud-Incus, VMS Fog-Incus, and Incus-member. And so if I go over here at this point to servers again, and I go down to VMS Cloud-Incus instead, I have the same containers listed, container test, and I have virtual machine, desktop, and desktop 2404. And if I look at the cluster members from the point of view of this particular machine, it says it is part of the default cluster group. Whoops, I clicked on cluster group. I meant to click on cluster members, and here it has the same three cluster members, VMS Cloud-Incus, VMS Fog-Incus, and Incus-member. So let's go ahead and go back down to the terminal prompt, and let's go ahead and do an Incus launch images : Ubuntu /24.04, and we'll go ahead and call this container new on cluster, and it will go ahead and launch the container named new on cluster. So now if we do an Incus list from the point of view of Incus-member, we have the listing of desktop, desktop 2404, new on cluster, and test. If I look at it from the point of view of VMS Cloud-Incus by doing an Incus list, I have the same four containers. And if I go down here to VMS Fog-Incus and I do the same Incus list it will also list the same for containers. And now here we are over on Incus-member, which was the latest cluster member that we added. And recall that it was never a standalone server. We never performed a traditional Incus admin init until we joined it to the cluster. So we can also do things like Incus profile list, and that will list out the bridge profile, which of course I presented in LexD step by step. And in virtue of the fact that Incus member is a cluster member, it knows about the bridge profile, and it also obviously knows about the other containers, where we can do an Incus list and see all of those containers and also control them from here. So this was not meant to be an exhaustive exercise on learning everything about clusters. So in summary, Incus clusters are more complex than standalone servers, but they provide higher availability for your containers. And in a cluster with 3 members, all members replicate the distributed database that stores the state of the cluster. And if the cluster has more than 3 members, only the first 3 of them replicate the database. The remaining members have access to the database, but have no need to replicate it. So a 2-node cluster can operate, but cannot establish quorum to maintain its distributed database. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell, and we'll see you next time.